New York, the world capital of power and style. And at its heart, a museum with secrets dark and strange. A nude statue linked to murder, the mysterious power of an Egyptian temple. A suit of armor that sheds new light on the bloodlust of Henry VIII. Secrets hidden in plain sight inside the Metropolitan Museum. New York's Metropolitan Museum draws 5 million visitors every year. For a century and a half, the Met has been the hub for famous, priceless art from all over the world, in a city that defines American culture. At the center of this skylit sculpture court stands Diana. Many statues depict the naked human form, but in this case, nudity matters. Diana's nudity is linked to America's first tabloid murder sensation. A drug-addicted millionaire playboy and a lascivious upper-crust architect were both entangled in a love triangle with America's most famous beauty. And all had a fateful connection to the bronze statue of Diana, ancient goddess of the hunt. In 1892, Diana was the tallest object on the Manhattan skyline. In Victorian America, this was as risque as it got. Commissioned by architect Stanford White, she was created by American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens.
Diana is bathing by a woodland pool, and she senses that she's being spied on, and she stands up nude, shoots her arrow at the young Prince Actaeon, who is then transformed into the stag. So because she had to be nude in this story, sculptors liked this idea of having a veiled reason for creating a nude figure.
White placed Diana at the pinnacle of what was then Madison Square Garden. Not the sports arena we know today, but an earlier building surmounted by an ornate tower. Illuminated by a powerful spotlight, Diana could be seen by every New Yorker.
There were newspaper reports that nannies had to rush their charges through Madison Square Park, and you might walk into some old gentleman with his spy glasses who had them craned up on Diana so he could get a close look at this nude figure.
Diana was a figure from Roman mythology, but spoke to an America where modesty was on its way out and overt display was on its way in. A real woman who embodied this spirit was an artist's model named Evelyn Nesbit. Many New Yorkers came to believe her face and figure were the inspiration for Diana. Like a supermodel of today, Evelyn was first famous for her looks, and then famous for being famous. Her life became a source of gossip and speculation in the pages of a new kind of newspaper, one New York City helped invent: the celebrity tabloid. Barry Levine is the executive editor of the National Enquirer.
Evelyn was a Marilyn Monroe. She was on the scale of today's actresses, she would be up there with Angelina Jolie, a woman that was just the personification of every man's fantasy at the time.
Stanford White shared this fantasy. The famous architect was also an infamous womanizer. He was rumored to have a secret love nest in the penthouse of Madison Square Garden, where he seduced many young women, like Evelyn Nesbit. Wanderly White is Stanford White's great-granddaughter.
He met her when she was merely 14 years old, but she was an absolutely breathtaking beauty. He saw that in her and decided to take her under his wing. At At the turn of the century, the thing to remember is even though a woman was 14 years old, that was considered nearly the right age to get married at and have children. It was a different society than the one we live in now. So even though she was so young, becoming his mistress wasn't like we would see it today as practically a case of pedophilia.
Evelyn Nesbit biographer Paula Uruburu takes a less charitable view of White's sexual preference and method of seduction.
So Stanford White had this, he used to call them snuggeries. He had these apartments apparently in various places around the city, and he would invite these young girls in. And Evelyn, the fateful night, he invites her to this apartment. He's giving her champagne, and in one end of the apartment, there was this red velvet swing hanging from the ceiling. She gets on the red velvet swing that's hanging from the rafters in the ceiling in one corner of the apartment and pushing her on the swing and telling her to kick her foot through this Japanese parasol, this paper parasol that's hung from the ceiling. And the higher he pushes her, the closer she comes to piercing the parasol. Of course, she's already been plied with a great deal of champagne. The way Evelyn described it in her own memoir, she said, when I went into that room, I was a virgin. When I came out, I was not. When she becomes conscious, White is next to her and he's naked and she's almost naked, and he says, now you belong to me.
Evelyn kept the liaison secret from everyone, including a new man who entered her life, millionaire playboy Harry Thaw.
Harry Thaw was born into this wealthy family. In the 1890s, we're talking about there's no income tax or anything. But the minute that he's 18, his mother, she upped his allowance to $80,000 a month, which is an insane amount of money. Harry was probably a cocaine fiend. That was the term they used at the time. He always had this sort of manic, glazed look in his eyes, and almost every picture you see of him, I mean, he looks crazy. Harry was clearly indulging in everything there was possible to indulge in.
Stanford White used his considerable influence in New York society to shut Thaw out. The two men hated each other.
Thaw had a tremendous cocaine problem and would go into cocaine rages and throw around 15th century furniture that my great-grandparents had brought back from Europe. Stanford White had blackballed him from joining any of the clubs. Thaw took a tremendous affront to this, and in response married Stanford White's mistress.
On their wedding night, Evelyn revealed that White had taken her virginity. Thaw flew into a violent rage, and over time came to assault his bride with a dog whip.
When Thaw realized that Stanford White wasn't heartbroken or crushed or infuriated by this, it made him even more incensed. And he started on the notion that Stanford White had ruined his wife, and not only that, had used her as the model for a statue that was at the top of the original Madison Square Garden.
Thaw's anger, fueled by righteous indignation and cocaine, coalesced into a plan of action. He decided White must pay with his life. June 25th, 1906. In an open-air theater beneath the statue of Diana, Harry Thaw and Evelyn Nesbit attend a musical performance. Seeing Stanford White, Thaw takes out a pistol, approaches to point-blank range, and shoots him in the face.
White fell to the ground. People started screaming. People started rushing away from this man who was holding up the gun. Harry was holding up the gun, saying, I did it because he ruined my wife.
Beneath the statue that helped trigger Thaw's rage, Stanford White dies in a pool of blood. The arrest and trial that follow ignite a media frenzy in New York and beyond.
This was the granddaddy of all tabloid stories. The trial that we kids considered the trial of the century was O.J. Simpson. This at the time probably was bigger. It had all the elements. It had a love triangle. It had violence. It had betrayal. I think this is the type of story, if this had occurred today, this would wipe Brad and Angelina and the Tom Cruise type stories, you know, off the map. And this would be the story that would be talked about day in and day out.
The trial results in a hung jury. At Thaw's second trial, Evelyn Nesbit takes the stand as the prosecution's star witness. All of America hangs on her tale of seduction at the hands of Stanford White. Many felt her husband was within his rights to defend her honor with a gun. Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Evelyn Nesbit, America's first supermodel, faded into obscurity, dying alone after a long struggle with drugs and alcohol. And as it turns out, the statue that sparked the murder wasn't really Evelyn after all. When Diana was created, Evelyn was just 7 years old. But as they say in the tabloids, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Diana may be made of bronze, but as tabloid stories go, she's solid gold. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has over 15,000 pieces in its arms and armor collection. One piece in particular has been at the center of mystery. For many years, this suit of armor was thought to belong to a minor 16th century French nobleman. But recently discovered documents and forensic evidence have led to a startling revelation. This is actually the last battle armor of a king of England, Henry VIII. Armed with this knowledge, we hope to reveal an elusive secret. Why did a monarch who was once athletic and popular end his reign as an obese tyrant? Met curator Stuart Peer helped discover the armor's true owner.
In 1547, Henry VIII died. A complete inventory of his collection was made, including every chair, every piece of bed linen, but all the armors. And there was an armor called Italian and described in such a way that sounded very similar to the one in our collection.
The armor sounded similar, but Peer couldn't be sure. He couldn't even be certain Henry's armor had survived to the present day. But he had a clue. The will of the Earl of Pembroke. It mentions armor given to him by his benefactor, Henry VIII.
The documentation seemed overwhelming, so we had to look at the armor with fresh eyes.
A fresh look revealed something no one had seen before.
It was only in dismantling the armor and looking at every detail we began to realize that there were changes in the armor, that some plates were of a different color. The etching was slightly different, the gilding brighter.
Then Peer noticed something one would only expect to find on armor belonging to Henry VIII.
New studs were added, and those studs have Tudor roses.
The Tudor rose was Henry's symbol, his favorite decorative design.
An emblem that was completely overlooked for the last 400 years.
The clincher was the armor's enormous size. It was constructed to accommodate a 51-inch waist. Clearly, the man who wore this suit of armor was morbidly obese. Henry's biographer, Susanna Liscombe, is not surprised the king got so fat.
The thing about Henry VIII's eating habits is that he mostly ate meat. In those days, you ate meat if you could afford it, so it's probably a very sort of vitamin-free diet without any fresh vegetables, none of his 5 a day that we're recommended to eat. So he would have obviously put on a lot of weight, taking in all that protein and without anything to work it off.
It wasn't always this way. As a young king, Henry was considered one of the most handsome and athletic men in all of Europe. All his life, Henry loved the art of war and fashion. Armor was the ultimate combination of both. Henry often donned armor to indulge in the sport of jousting. This is a suit of armor from his younger, slimmer days.
This armor shows the king at his most glorious, the warrior king, astride a horse, which is where he liked to be, jousting, fighting, competing. And it shows him also very slim. And obviously it's the outside, so the measurements might be slightly off. But at the top here, you can see the chest is about 42 inches, and the waist is about 35.
But Henry didn't keep his trim figure. Liscombe believes that one specific incident may be the cause of Henry's late onset obesity, and perhaps a negative personality change. On January 24, 1536, during a jousting match, Henry suffered a serious accident. Head trauma rendered him unconscious for 2 hours. From that day forward, he became more erratic and violent. Within months, he ordered Anne Boleyn beheaded. During the remainder of his reign, he ordered the execution of more than 50,000 of his subjects. Could head trauma have altered Henry's personality?
Maybe he bruised his cerebral cortex. And in the papers over the last few years, there have been all these references to American footballers and others who've had head accidents and then have seen a real change in their character and personality. And we think maybe that's what happened to Henry.
If a jousting accident changed Henry's personality, why did it change it for the worse? Dr. Naftali Berle is a New York neuropsychologist. He sees cases like this all the time.
Sometimes you hear stories like, gee, you know, before the head trauma, they were fairly calm. After the accident, a personality change occurred. And you hear reports from family and people that know the individual that they behave in a way that suggests a level of discontrol. They become irritable, violent, unpredictable, assaultive, obnoxious, and sometimes they commit crimes as a consequence.
It's a textbook description of Henry VIII's condition. And this armor, acquired when he was nearly too fat to walk, let alone go into battle, suggests that Henry's ambitions were also out of control.
Later in life, there's one more attempt to regain his lost glory. So in the 1540s, he thinks, well, I'll invade France again.
To lead the invasion, Henry required his armor to be supersized.
It turns out, in fact, that it was modified for Henry's body after it was given by the Italian milliner. It was cut. Plates were added at the sides of the armholes to perhaps give it more flexibility and comfort for the king. The breast and the back were shortened. A plate was taken out in the front, at least 2 in the back, which truncated the upper body. The helmet was modified to add 2 new plates to the back to give it more flexibility, something that only the king would have wanted. It wasn't necessary otherwise.
Against the advice of his counselors, Henry donned his armor and led the English army into France. The invasion was a complete, unmitigated disaster.
And this is the midlife crisis for Henry. It shows that Henry cannot regain his past glory.
Soon after, Henry died, a huge man and a huge failure. His legacy was a needless war and a depleted treasury. Today, doctors might rush to Henry's defense, explaining that his erratic and criminal behavior was caused by a jousting accident that led to a neurological disorder.
Well, if you were called as a court expert for the defense in Henry's case, what you would have to lay out for the jury or the judge, that there is a neurophysiologic process at work. It's not the devil, but it is in fact a compromise to the way the brain is working and functioning that turned perhaps a mild-mannered individual, a reasoned individual, into someone who's just out of control and running wild.
This tragicomic suit of armor protected his bloated body, but could not save England from his bloated ambition. Within the walls of the Metropolitan Museum is a massive temple of ancient Egypt. The Temple of Dender can be seen from outside the museum, through a wall of glass. "25 meters across, 8 meters tall, the temple's gallery is the size of a football field. It is one of the Met's most popular attractions. But visitors are not permitted to enter the secret chamber at its heart. This is an exclusive look beyond the forbidden threshold.
So you move through a temple, and it goes from light to dark, and it goes uphill, so that the central part of the temple, the most sacred area, which is the shrine, sanctuary, which would be here, is the darkest and the highest point of the temple. There is behind this wall an empty chamber. It's a hidden chamber, you can't see it.
The purpose of this hidden chamber is a museum secret. When we scan the temple walls for clues, we find nothing about the chamber. But we do see something else. Images that have no business in an Egyptian temple. Images of a Roman emperor. Caesar Augustus. Augustus conquered Egypt in 30 BC, famously prompting Queen Cleopatra and her lover Mark Antony to commit suicide. Unlike other empire builders, Augustus did not force his beliefs on conquered nations. His genius lay in embracing local customs for his own benefit.
The Romans built the temple in the Egyptian style because it was much easier to control the population that way. The Romans wanted cooperation from Egypt because they saw Egypt as an agriculturally rich country which they needed to exploit for the Roman world.
To win Egyptian hearts and minds, Augustus allowed the temple to be dedicated to 2 local boys. They are Pedesi and Pior, young sons of a local chieftain who was an important ally of Augustus.
They occur several times in the temple. Pedesi is always the first one, so he is believed to be more important. We don't know why they are treated as gods in this temple. One understanding is that they both drowned in the Nile, and when humans drowned in the Nile, they were deified immediately. We just know that they were revered enough, possibly local saints in some way, to be given a place in this temple.
The Egyptians who used the temple would soon discover that Augustus' love was strictly temporary. A few years after the temple was finished, his army invaded in force. Egypt fell under Rome's boot, never to rise again. The temple, however, remained standing until the 1960s, when it became one of many ancient structures threatened by the construction of the Aswan Dam. A UN mission largely funded by the United States helped save many important monuments. To thank their benefactors, Egypt offered America the Temple of Dender. The gift had one condition. The temple must be available to everyone at all times. The Met responded by providing a gallery with a wall of glass, so the temple can remain in view 24/7.
It's amazing to find a structure inside a building, and this is a whole building. It's actually even more than a building. It's a setting because it includes not only
the temple structure, but it includes the gateway. And then it's been put in an environment to give you a feel for actually something that's outdoors. And that's one of a kind. It doesn't exist anywhere else in this country.
For believers in the gods of the pharaohs, a temple available to everyone retains its spiritual power. What is this power? And what of the chamber deep inside the temple walls? To construct a temple with such a symmetrical plan, and then dig through the walls to add a hidden chamber, the builders must have had some important purpose in mind.
There are two hypotheses. One is that it was a burial chamber for one or both of the brothers who were worshipped in this temple. And the other possibility is that it was a chamber for oracles. In other words, someone would stand in there, a supplicant would come in, or a priest would come in and ask a question, and the answer would be given to him from an unknown place. All they would hear is a voice. This was something that was common in Egypt. Oracles existed, but we just don't know if that's what it was. We have no hard answers.
Today, the Temple of Dendor offers a glimpse of ancient Egypt in the heart of Manhattan. In its own time, it was a monument to the end of the most enduring civilization the world has ever known. According to the New Testament, at the Last Supper, Jesus raised a cup of wine to his disciples and said, "This is my blood." Today in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, there is an artifact that looks very much like a cup from biblical times. The ancient name for cup is Grail. In years past, several scholars of early Christianity argued that this was the cup Christ drank from at the Last Supper, the chalice known as the Holy Grail. Helen Evans is a curator of Byzantine art.
There are many people trying to prove that both Christ and an Old Testament figure like Moses were or were not real human beings. Were they historical figures or were they epic heroes like Achilles? And so this is a huge theological debate of the era, and this chalice and what the images on it represent play into that larger debate.
The artifact was discovered in the early 1900s in Antioch, hidden in a well with several other precious religious relics. Shortly after the crucifixion, Antioch became a center for Christianity. Both Peter and Paul preached here. Is it possible they brought Christ's chalice with them? Careful examination reveals that the artifact is comprised of two very different layers. The outer shell is highly crafted, decorated with images of Christ and his disciples. But inside is a simple, unadorned cup. Just the sort of crude drinking vessel that might have been owned by a poor carpenter like Jesus. Shortly after the outbreak of World War I, the relic was transported to New York for safekeeping. A respected expert examined it and declared it to be the cup of Christ.
And what could be more important than to find the Holy Grail, the beginning of the Eucharist, the Mass of the Christian Church?
In the 1920s and 30s, the artifact was exhibited throughout America as the true Holy Grail. Armed guards were hired to protect it. Thousands of Christians lined up to catch a fleeting look. But when the artifact was gifted to the Met in 1950, museum experts gave it another hard look. They saw clear indications it was made 500 years after Christ. And though it looks like a cup, it looks much more like the oil lamps found in early churches. While experts felt they had closed the case, many believers sought a different verdict from a higher power, the Catholic Church.
When the chalice came to the Met in 1950, there had been a huge effort to get the Vatican to declare that this was the Holy Grail. There have been huge efforts to get the Vatican over time to declare many things to be the sacred object.
The Vatican declined. And in the years since then, as interest faded, the artifact was consigned to a quiet corridor. But even though this is not the Holy Grail, it still carries the hopes of those who want to believe.
People want to touch things that are important to them. You get autographs because you admire this figure. You want to have Derek Jeter's signature because you're a Yankee fan and he's the captain of the team. And that's what a relic is. It's something that gives you access to the holy by being able to touch it.
From Christian hope, we turn to Christian visions of doom. This is the manuscript of the Apocalypse, a 14th century volume containing dramatic, frightening illustrations of the end of days. The manuscript is displayed in the Met's satellite museum known as the Cloisters. And if it looks like something from the Middle Ages, that's because it was constructed of elements taken from medieval structures. Doorways, windows, and walls, purchased in Europe and transported to New York. The building on view today has a tranquil beauty that is more than the sum of its medieval parts. Few artifacts capture the dark and brooding qualities of the era, quite like the manuscript of the Apocalypse. It is a book of power and secrets. Barbara Bohm is a manuscript curator.
All great works of art are reluctant to give up all their secrets at once, and this is no exception. It must have been in England, and then it came back to France. This piece was confiscated by the Nazis. We don't know where it was exactly during the Second World War. So it's extraordinary, with all of this difficult past that it's had, that it's survived in such remarkable condition.
The manuscript predicts that the world as we know it is doomed to end. Christ will return to judge the living and the dead. And as written in the book of John, the end will be heralded by 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, bringers of pestilence, war, famine, and death. Bernard McGinn is a retired professor of divinity from the University of Chicago.
The literal interpretation of the book of Revelation is alive and well at the beginning of the 21st century. And according to certain polls, a very large proportion, if not a majority, of American believers think that Jesus will come back in their own lifetime.
For some believers, the signs of the apocalypse are already here.
Apocalyptic literature is in part a response to crisis, and a crisis that in some way hopes for a denouement in a final age of history. But sometimes that denouement or that end is seen as far, far away. At other times it's remarkably close and even predictably close.
Medieval Christians had reason to believe that John the Apostle's end times were at hand. Famine, war, and the pestilence of the Black Death were part of everyday life.
And at various points through history, people are sort of anxiously awaiting the idea that time is about to come to an end. The good news is if you play your cards right and you do what you're supposed to do, you end up in a very happy place at the end of time. So even if the story has some frightening scenes, you can anticipate that that's not going to involve you because you're going to be on the right side of things.
Not everyone sees a bright side to the frightening violence of our age, but for some believers, the violence that heralds Christ's return is actually good news that should be shared. The book's illustrated form presented a powerful message then, and it's one that still resonates today.
Well, I think the notion of Revelation as a graphic novel is an extremely powerful notion, and one that fits it in terms of our cultural milieu very, very exactly. The book seems to lend itself to the pictorial imagination of the particular era within which it is, so that no book of the Bible has been more illustrated and had a more powerful effect on art and literature than the book of the Apocalypse.
And there's another mystery surrounding the book. There are pages missing. There is evidence the manuscript is incomplete.
There's some missing pictures. And that probably happened at quite a recent date. If I turn this page, I think you'll see on this page there's a great illumination, on this page there's a great illumination. And here's just half a page, you see. And it's been cut out.
There's no way to know when the pages were removed or by whom, but the book was in the hands of the Nazis, and Hitler was obsessed with the supernatural. Did he or his followers believe the manuscript of the Apocalypse had some special power?
And it's odd in particular with an Apocalypse because the text itself says that one must be very careful that the words are incorrectly. Well, what I mean is that you'll end up in the mouth of hell if you don't get this right.
This book is the key to the past and the revelation of the future. And it's a power that's not dead today. The book can be a dangerous book when it's read only in a strictly literal sense.
But no one can control how books like this are read. There will be those who interpret the apocalyptic vision as metaphor or warning. And there will always be those who say, "It's coming, bring it on." In medieval times, European armorers worked to provide maximum protection for elite soldiers. By the 20th century, war had become a bloody struggle between unarmored forces. Armor making was by then a lost art. But when America entered World War I in 1917, the military, concerned about potential casualties, turned to the Metropolitan Museum. Deep below the public galleries is a room that few ever see. A room that played a crucial role in saving the lives of countless soldiers. Stuart Peer is the curator in charge of arms and armor.
One of the least well-known aspects of the Metropolitan Museum is its contribution to the war efforts in World War I and World War II. In 1917, the War Department contacted the museum's curator of arms and armor, Bashford Dean, and asked him to apply his historical knowledge of ancient armor to the development of modern helmets and body armor for the current conflict.
Bashford Dean had a double challenge: to design a helmet that would provide protection and be something soldiers would agree to wear.
Getting the modern soldier to accept a steel helmet was an uphill battle. It couldn't be too heavy. It couldn't be outsized, one that got in the way.
For inspiration, Bashford Dean studied the Met's medieval armor collection. He found many examples of helmets that struck a balance between form and function. He conceived and built several promising prototypes. But the war ended before his work was complete, and the prototypes were shelved. In retrospect, this may have been short-sighted. Bashford Dean died before the start of World War II, but his protege carried on his work.
The museum's armorer came up with this design, very much based on the M1 helmet, but more compact, with the idea being a smaller head and more compact helmet would be more efficient in the battlefield.
After the helmet, the Met moved on to body armor. This 15th century armor, too fragile to display in the public galleries, was an inspiration.
The textile is on the outside, the plates on the inside, and they would have been covered by another coat of textile. And then wrapping around, this is the back, it was wrapped around jacket-like, sleeveless jacket, and tied in the front. It provided a flexible, armored defense.
This is the Met's revolutionary design. Medieval technology, updated for the 20th century battlefield. Once again, the brutal war came to an end before the Met's design could be tested. Today's helmets look remarkably like Bashford Dean's original design. He saw the future by looking into the past. The Met's body armor proved even more prophetic. Some modern soldiers wear armor made from independent plates, held together by flexible material. Such armor can withstand high-caliber, high-velocity rifle fire. This is the body armor of the 21st century, but the underlying technology was invented by medieval craftsmen and updated by the curators of the Metropolitan Museum. Unfortunately, no one can know how many lives might have been spared had the Met's prototypes gone into production a century ago. Square feet, over 2 million works of art, 5 million visitors per year. At New York's Metropolitan Museum, there's a new marvel around every corner. But there are more marvels the public can't see just below their feet. In the Met's Department of Scientific Research, scientists use state-of-the-art technology to solve ancient mysteries.
The laboratory is essentially a fully equipped, modern analytical chemistry lab. We're dealing, if you think about our collection, with 5,000 years of history from 5 continents. So every possible material that's being used by humankind in artistic production is represented here. We have glass, wood, stone, organic material, textiles. We have natural materials and synthetic materials.
Recently, the lab acquired a new tool. Used by NASA to study Martian soil samples, only a handful of the world's museums have one. This is a Raman spectrometer. For important and fragile artifacts, the Raman spectrometer offers a non-invasive way to reveal a unique molecular fingerprint.
The Raman microscope is an ideal technique because it's both non-invasive. It works extremely well for materials such as traditional inorganic pigments.
Here's how it works. First, a microscopic sample is taken from an artwork using an ultra-sharp tungsten needle. The sample is smaller than the width of a human hair. Next, it's placed in a solution containing tiny particles of silver. Placed under a laser, the shiny silver amplifies the sample's chemical properties. The laser scans the sample, seeking its molecular fingerprint. The result is a graphic signature of the chemical elements.
And the result is incredible. We go from not seeing anything to almost by magic seeing a very distinct signal that corresponds to the molecule present in the color.
Leona put the spectrometer to work to discover how ancient Egyptians made a stable red dye, thousands of years before any other civilization. Scans of Egyptian textiles revealed a chemical composition identical to a rare plant. A plant that would have required sophisticated processing to extract a viable pigment.
Ancient Egyptians knew 4,000 years ago that a certain plant, once you pulled it out from the ground and extracted its roots with an alkaline solution, so with a base such as natron, and then treated it with aluminum salts such as alum, you could obtain these pink colors. It sounds simple, but the type of chemical reactions that are involved in this process they're very complex. You can almost think of the ancient Egyptians going through a discovery process that's no way different than modern science.
Using the spectrometer, Leona made a discovery about world trade during the time of the Crusades. The paint on this French Madonna came from Asia.
So you have to imagine this huge trade chain that went from India all the way to southern France in the Middle Ages, in the 1100s. And if you think about it, to me it's fascinating because we're talking about a global trade connection at a time where Europe and the Muslim world, which would have been the intermediary for this type of commerce, were at war at the time of the Crusades.
The spectrometer provides a new way to explore the past.
The term that I use is we're trying to build a material history of art. So essentially doing art history through science.
This new material history is changing Leona's view of how artists work.
We're seeing that artists, instead of being completely disconnected from this, are supremely aware of that and exploit to their advantage the properties of materials. So, and that's really also the definition of a scientist, somebody who can take a material, knowing the properties, and bring it to some kind of use.
For every mystery science reveals, far more remain unspoken. Secrets of the past and of the human heart, hidden in plain sight at the Metropolitan Museum.